So next we have Tobias, and he has a background in design interactions from London College of Communications and the RCA. He's an internationally exhibiting artist, an associate designer at Superflux, a tutor for the design for interaction and moving image at LCC, and a designer and researcher for AirUp's Foresight and Innovation in London.
Can I take this off? Is that okay? Yeah. Cool, thank you. Hi, thanks very much. Yeah, I'm Tobias. I'm an artist and designer from London, but I'm here as an artist. I'm going to be talking about my work a little bit, but mostly focusing on talking about world building, because it's really the core of my practice, and I also think it's one of the most important and powerful tools that as a creative person you have for really talking about complex and difficult ideas. So everyone builds worlds. It's one of the first things you do as a child. You start to construct scenarios and fantasies in your mind in order to play out the rules that there are in the world and experiment with interactions around you. And then that goes on to inform the psychology behind why we all read fiction and watch movies and things like that. For me, I continued with video games. SimCity is an incredible opportunity to build your own world and get your God complex out in the open. And I've stuck with it. So these are 4 projects that I've done recently that all exist within their own world. And I didn't construct the worlds for the purpose of fantasy. I constructed them because I wanted a way to talk about very complicated ideas outside of the context of our world, where often things can get muddled and messed up and difficult and very hard to read. So like I say, it's really, the purpose of world building isn't to create fantasies and escapism. The purpose is to give a new perspective, to give a new way to talk about things, and to give people the opportunity to suspend their disbelief so they can deal with things that might otherwise be difficult. So this is how I see reality, mostly. It's a bit of a mess, and there's a lot of stuff going on, and it's really hard to figure out how things relate, and what's important and what's significant, and how you read it and how you pass it. But as a world builder, you have the license to edit reality. Really, a fiction is just an edited version of reality. So you can create a fiction where the things you think are important are amplified highly, and you can just get rid of the stuff that's really boring. And you've got to be really careful, though. There are 2 things you've got to be careful of. The first is that you don't amplify things too much. If you make them impossible, they become a fantasy, and no one can buy into that because it's like fairies or dragons or whatever. And the other thing you must be exceptionally careful of is topias. Both utopias and dystopias are nefarious. They are used by nefarious people for nefarious ends. They're always negative. They exist as a carrot and a stick. The utopia is this constant promise of good things that you can never achieve, and a dystopia is the constant threat of violent reprimand. So you have to go back. There you go. So utopia is almost always used for selling something, and you can think here of the colonization of the Americas, religious extremism, and perhaps worst of all, advertising. They all try and sell you something that is unachievable. They're very thin, and if you examine a utopia, you tend to find them lacking in any substance. And its evil cousin, of course, is the dystopia, and there's some interesting ideas about it being the major driving force of Western civilization, where we exist constantly in fear of the worst thing that could happen unless we change our ways. We're constantly pushed into false agency, but it's really there to paralyze and threaten. What you want is something in between, the uncanny normal. It's a place that's eerily familiar. It looks just like our world. We understand it. The rules are the same. It looks the same. The iconography is the same. And yet there's something wrong. There's something different. There's something that's unsettling. And in there you start to ask the right kind of questions of the real world and the fictional world. So there are 2 major techniques for world building that were established in the 70s by science fiction authors: the bottom-up approach and the top-down approach. And I'm just quickly going to talk about those 2, and then we can look at how designers can work, or artists can work with them as well. So J.R.R. Tolkien was very famous for inventing the top-down approach. Before he wrote The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings, he invented the entire universe that they're set in. So he wrote the languages, he wrote the songs, the mythologies, he drew the maps, and then he threaded the story of the characters through them as a way to kind of bring elements of that world into our vision that we have through the books. And the other approach is the bottom-up approach, made famous by, well, one of my favorite ones is Mervyn Peake, the Gormenghast trilogy, where we have a very limited, secluded set of characters in a very small space, one castle. But from that, from their behaviors, from their interactions, from the things they do, we extrapolate the rest of the world from it. Very little is given away to us, but a lot is implied. And that's often in design called diegetic prototyping, which Bruce Sterling calls the intentional suspending of disbelief about change. You create an object that doesn't quite work in the real world, that doesn't fit here, but seems to imply somewhere else. And then from that, once you exhibit it or talk about it, you invite people to extrapolate what kind of world this might exist in. Stanley Kubrick was one of the greatest diegetic prototypers. He invented the iPad in 1964. Way before Apple even came up with the idea. 2001: A Space Odyssey involves very few characters and a very limited storyline. The entire world is implied through the incredible use of prototypes and technologies and objects and instructions that imply so much about the world in which it's set. Another technique is story writing. This is something I've been trying out for my latest project, where you write an actual narrative. You write a beginning, a middle, and an end, and I literally wrote 10,000 words of a story. And you're kind of constraining the imagination of the viewer here and getting into your world, in that you're setting down the bounds of where the world exists. But at the same time, you're given more space to teach them and tell them about the relationships and the characters in the world and the objects and how that works. And through doing that, you hope to teach people to read the world better. You can kind of see the way that people work together, the way they stand, the way they talk to each other, implies something about their ideology, implies something about the way they think or feel or how they consume things or whatever. And then the third way that I've used as well is building a history. So this was a project where I built 2,000 years of history of power. I designed it. I did full research right back to the Roman Empire. And the reason behind that is because I wanted to find out and I wanted to realize how all events have a long-term knock-on effect. Like further down the line, you might not realize it, but everything counts for something. And that's perhaps one of the most powerful tools, because through that, you can question the way the world really is. And you can actually look at it and you can kind of re-examine it and reconstruct events as they happened and see maybe how hundreds of years before something might have led up to that. And really, to me, that's the responsibility. The responsibility I have as an artist is to try and do that, is to question that accepted narrative. Thanks very much.